to our first Rutgers Colloquia, sponsored by the School of Communication and Information and our program in the Professional Certificate for Digital Asset Management. I'm David LIPSEY, and I'll be serving you as our host for our time together today. And when I say good day, we're appreciative that we can mean good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, all at the same time for the geographies that we represent. We've chosen the word colloquia with intent. In its meanings to confer and converse, we find the opportunity for engaged dialogue. And if anything is at the heart of our topic today, it is truly to confer and to converse. This word and this idea reminds us of the many peoples who have lived here and talked here and walked here and created here before us. The happenstance of my presence in the riparian forests along the Potomac River was preceded by the happenstance of the Nacostan Indians, an indigenous Algonquin people here in the Washington, D.C. area. We know and affirm that inclusion recognizes peoples and cultures long before us. We honor this. While we meet virtually today, our journey will visit lands and events that span thousands of miles and often years measured in centuries. We're here to mark this journey to examine issues in museum equity, reparation, and their digital dimensions. Today, we'll explore and witness incremental shifts moving the museum field forward with bold new approaches to how digital asset and collections management supports these innovations and initiatives. A beacon of inspiration to me personally and for our time together will be sharing her views. Social justice and DEI museum leader, Monica O. Montgomery, will discuss museum remedy, processes for engagement and repair, with guidance for equitable strategies in an evolving landscape of return. We will also examine case studies of museums as better neighbors, sharing the perspectives of 3 professionals working to boost social awareness around origins of sculptural and sacred items from Native American and African communities, current exhibitions from the University of Michigan Museum of Art, and a project partnership between the Anchorage Museum and Chickaloon Village Tribal Council are vibrant case studies redefining ethics, intellectual property, and best practices around remedy and digital enablement all along the way. Almost everything today that is created has a digital twin, and we manage these, or we try to manage these, and we certainly don't want the new or the old in a digital orphanage. What we are here to discuss today is a merger of the currents of the past from lands afar, merging with the digital rivers that invisibly surround us, and perhaps more often than we would like, define our experience. Each generation finds itself with an opportunity to flip the Kuhnian paradigm. This one is ours. We may unbind content from its corporeal form, but we don't want unstable particles floating around in the digital supply chain. We're the ones to lead this. We're the ones to know that the past is not destiny when new awareness in the physical and the digital is the central compelling force. And to do this better, we're going to turn now to our welcome speakers. As we do this, please note that we have plenty of time at the end of the session for Q&A, and we'll use the usual Zoom tools we know all too well for this. And we will make the recording available to everyone who is registered. And with that, I'd like to first introduce Laura BECKER from the University of Michigan. And Laura, I'm going to turn this over to you, and welcome. Thanks so much for working together with me on getting ready for today.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are calling in from, and thank you for spending time with us today to reflect on these extremely important and timely issues that I can almost guarantee will raise more questions than answers, than provide answers. My name is Laura de BECKER. I am the Helmut and Candis Stern Curator of African Art at the University of Michigan Museum of Art, where I'm also Interim Chief Curator. And I have been based there for the last 6 years after working in South Africa and in Rwanda, in England, and in Belgium. And I'm here to talk to you about a particular case study and exhibition that we are currently working on, and its relationship to questions of ethics, restitution, and ownership. Let me start by sharing my screen. Here we go. Great.
Looks perfect.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I would also like to start by thanking David and his colleagues at Rutgers for bringing us together. It is truly a really great honor for me to be in conversation with my fellow speakers today who have thought so deeply about the many dimensions of restitution, especially when I find myself at a time when we are sort of starting our own project and when we are grappling with these issues in real time. So as I mentioned, the case study I'll be talking about today is an exhibition that I co-curated at the University of Michigan Museum of Art, titled "Wish You Were Here, African Art and Restitution." In this exhibition, which is currently on view in Ann Arbor, my team grapples in a very public way with 11 artworks from UMA's permanent African art collection that we have throughout the years flagged for review. The relatively simple premise of the project is to use the resources that are typically set aside for exhibition making and direct them towards provenance research, towards building upon and creating new partnerships with African colleagues and institutions, towards developing guidelines for our African collection at large, and to possibly returning artworks that are deemed candidates for repatriation. The research findings are shared in the exhibition space as we discover them to make the whole process as transparent and transferable as possible. And digital assets are part and parcel of this process, though sometimes in challenging and perhaps unexpected ways. To explain the overall framework and impetus of Wish You Were Here, I need to make a quick detour to another exhibition titled "We Write to You About Africa," the reinstallation of our permanent African galleries that I've been working on with my co-curator Ozi Uduma for the past 3 years. Both projects opened around the same time and are intricately intertwined as is suggested by their titles. We Write to You About Africa is an installation that uses the metaphor of the postcard to talk about collection practices, how at any given moment, any museum collection can only show a very small snapshot of Africa's cultural heritage, and one that is entirely fragmentary, subjective, and selective. We move away from the claim that we are able to show a supposed history of African art in a so-called gallery of African art. So we've actually also stopped calling this our gallery of African art, and instead point out that our collection is a direct result of the University of Michigan's interest in and engagement with the African continent. The title of this reinstallation, We Write to You About Africa, is very intentional, of course, and means to bring awareness to the notion that collections of African art in the global north are more telling about the worldview of those representing than those represented. Within the exhibition, there is also a section titled I Write to You from Africa, where we ask artists, community members, students, and scholars based on the continent to write to us about the works on display in the gallery in their language of origin on a postcard and send it to UMA. And we then have it translated into English and we display it alongside the work. While this is an additional method through which we mean to introduce multivocality in the galleries, the side project has also revealed some of the tensions that I want to think about today. Because when we presented this idea to one of our advisory groups, the African Students Association at the University of Michigan, they immediately pointed out the very outdated mode of communication. Postcards are, in fact, as they are across the world, little used by younger generations of Africans who use other storytelling methods. And so our African Students Association suggested that we do additional projects sort of titled, I WhatsApp you from Africa, or I TikTok you from Africa, or I PM you from Africa. And this tension between the digital and the physical keeps reemerging across my projects. I am grappling here in this reinstallation, as well as in Wish You Were Here, with the challenges of storytelling in exhibitions that involve unfolding, not static data, and how can we capture that in the context of institutions that elevate, if not worship, the physical. So another subsection of the permanent installation initially was Wish You Were Here. So it grew out of this project. Getting to know the collection these past 6 years as the inaugural African art curator at UMA and reviewing works for potential inclusion and display in our permanent gallery, I have throughout time developed a mental shortlist of artworks that I tend to avoid for public display. This reluctance has many points of origin, sometimes because of what the objects claim to be, such as sacred or ritually active objects, works that were only meant to be seen by particular groups or people, and not at all meant for public display, let alone in a museum context. Others of how and when they entered the collection, such as during times of great duress or distress, civil wars, coups d'etats, etc. And yet others, because they may be containers of human remains. The work in the middle photograph here on the slide may in fact be a container of human remains, as it is noted to be a reliquary. I would always flag these works, knowing that I would have to grapple with the ethical questions that they raise in the future before running off to the next project. And what that has created, and I believe that this is in fact true for a lot of curators of similar collections, is this whole subset of objects that have in reality become undisplayable. We don't know how to move forward with the research. We often lack the time, the financial support, or clear next steps to even start thinking about the possibility of repatriation. So these objects linger in storerooms for years, having little exposures to our audiences here, and really only a digital footprint, a presence in the database for audience worldwide. With Wish You Were Here, we decided to make these objects, the so-called red lists, the center of their own exhibition. We wanted to bring this work and the many challenges it poses to the forefront, to be as transparent as possible about process, and to recognize that process is, or at least should be, as important and valued as outcome. In the middle of the space, we display the 11 objects under investigation. Around the room, we have created a timeline that documents the history of the restitution debate, starting in 1868 with the looting of Magdala in Ethiopia. And just to be clear here, this is the history of the restitution debate as it pertains to African art. Historicizing the restitution conversation is a very intentional and integral part of the project, meaning to counter the notion that the urgency we feel about questions of restitution today is new. In fact, when Bénédicte Savoy, one of the authors of the 2018 report recommending next steps for restitution to French President Macron's cabinet, when she was in the midst of her archival research preparing her report, she came upon a previous report that had already been published in 1978 and had, to a degree, already done the work that she had been tasked to do. Savoy argues that we are dealing with double amnesia. We are dealing with an erasure of the colonial past as to how these works came to be in the global north in the first place, but also an erasure of the history of the restitution debate. In a recent presentation, Savoy compared this to the same amnesia around climate change. Every report starts anew, failing to make headway in moving forward what one's predecessors have already argued for, effectively going in circles. One of the cases included, one of the cases included on the historic timeline is of particular importance to our discussion today, and I hope and think that many of you will be familiar with it. This event, which has become known as the Nefertiti hack in popular culture, was an intervention by the artists Nora Al-Badri and Jan Nicolai Nellis in 2015, when they publicly released a 3D model of the famous Nefertiti bust, one of the iconic repatriation case studies where Egypt have been requesting this bust back from Germany, where it is located, for decades. The artists released the 3D model of the Nefertiti bust and encouraged anyone with an interest to print their own, which we in fact did for this exhibition, as you can see in the picture on the left. In an effort to bring attention to the digital dimension of colonialism and the continued hoarding of data as well as objects by museums in the global north. While the digital double should never be offered to communities of origin as a replacement for the original object, artwork's digital imprints are, of course, important sources of knowledge production that need to be addressed alongside the return of any physical objects. Colonial worldviews are embedded in our databases as much as they are in our museum spaces. So how do we decolonize this data? And how can we make this part of the process from the outset of repatriation conversations and not simply an afterthought? This is one of the many questions that we are grappling with and wish you were here. What I hope makes this project particularly interesting, and what I know makes it particularly challenging, is that this work is all taking place publicly and in real time. We document the steps that we undertake in the research on a living timeline that runs for as long as the exhibition is up. And we document and share dead ends, as well as research that helps us grapple with the meaty questions of ownership, legality, and ethics in an attempt to be as transparent as possible in how to move forward this work. The irony here is that, again, a lot of this work actually takes place in the digital realm. We're digging through databases, through archives. We're most of the time reaching out to specialists and partners on the continent. We are exchanging endless emails and Zooms, getting people's opinion about these matters. And then we have to take this research and give it a physical presence in the exhibition space. Because in order to succeed in sensitizing our visitors to the complexity of the conversation, we need to make sure that the research timeline is legible, of course, but also frankly interesting enough. So we are actually spending an inordinate amount of time translating digital data into physical ephemera, only to then have to revert them back while sharing this information with audiences outside of Ann Arbor, and when hopefully eventually returning these objects or their title of ownership to their source communities. And I do have a little view here. So this is the view in the gallery where, again, there's the irony of us sort of working in these, with these methods that actually introduce sort of archival feel and time, such as these 10 cards and Polaroids, etc., to capture what is mostly a digital process. And then we transfer that to this timeline, the story maps that we are creating for each of the case studies that we update again as we find out more. And that will be shared throughout the time of the exhibition and later. Let me go back here. I just wanted to linger for a second too on this idea of transferring title of ownership and not physical object, because a lot of cutting edge and groundbreaking conversations in our field have been exploring this idea of returning the right of ownership, but museums in the global north retaining the physical object as a long-term loan until it is requested back by its owners. This could be an interesting solution to issues of infrastructure in African institutions, which I just want to be very clear here. These are issues of infrastructure that museums across the world suffer from, mostly to do with lack of storage, always running out of storage, and not having the financial means to greatly expand storage if museums in the global north start sending back hundreds of objects, right? So it might be a solution to that. It might be an interesting idea because of the function that some objects have to act as ambassadors for particular countries of culture and cultures. And then thirdly, it's mostly, what I think is most interesting is retaining the physical objects could be a way to enforce continued engagement between institutions. Because the fear is that physical repatriation could be considered a done deal, with museums in the north washing their hands of any continued responsibility after the piece has been sent back. While a rights transfer model, and the next sentence I cannot emphasize enough, if so desired by source communities to work with a rights transfer model instead of a return of the physical object, would recognize the rightful owners and may bring them some financial revenue in the form of loan payments or in the form of payments for intellectual property rights from the museums that would host the object. So I think that that's a really interesting model that is worth discussing today. So as I mentioned and promised, this presentation and case study raises a lot more questions than it provides answers. But I do want to thank you to allow me the opportunity to talk to you all about this today. And I look forward to answering any questions during the Q&A session.
Laura, thanks so much for this. It's informative. It's stimulating to think about so many of the issues that are presented. And to complement this and perhaps to affirm and echo on a particular approach and to look at the many challenges involved, I now get the chance to introduce Monica SHAH and SELENA, let me get this right, SELENA ORTEGA-CHIOLERO, who are joining us from 2 different locations in Alaska today. And Monica and SELENA, please introduce yourself. And it's been such a delight working with you these past few weeks as we got ready to share a few ideas and projects. And I'm just crazy about what you 2 are doing and so glad to have the opportunity to learn a little bit more.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Rutgers University and the fellow presenters for inviting us to be here. We're talking about a project that's upcoming and we're just at the beginning phases. And so I will share my screen first and then we'll get started. I don't know how to do this. Sorry about that. We'll take a moment. I think I know how to do this after all these years.
And all these, you're all set now. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So good morning. I'm Monica SHAH and I serve the Anchorage Museum and its communities as the Deputy Director for Collections and Conservation. And I'm pleased to be joined by SELENA ORTEGA-CHIOLERO of the Chickaloon Village Traditional Council, who I will turn it over to SELENA for her introduction.
Kuiraba, Nihero Walakuhu, SELENA ORTEGA-CHIOLERO, Nihero Muri. Titula nene resna el izda, atna el denen nanaina el nena, Museum Specialist Naidiniana Kaya, ha hwesna. Greetings, everybody. My name is SELENA ORTEGA-CHIOLERO. I am Rara Muri, also known as the Tarahua Mara, the Barranca de Cobra region of Chihuahua, Mexico. I live and work on Matanuska Riverland, the traditional homelands of the Atna and Dena'ina Dene, where I am the museum specialist for Chickaloon Village Traditional Council, also known as CVTC, the governing body of Chickaloon Native Village. I have been working in museums for over a decade. Currently at Chickaloon, I am responsible for the preservation and access to the tribe's permanent collections and archives. I also support our Tribal Historic Preservation Officer with Repatriation and Cultural Site Preservation, and I support our Language and Culture Department with their language preservation and cultural tourism efforts. Monica?
Thank you, Selena. I am so pleased to be here. I wanted to give some context. I am also originally from Anchorage, and I work and live on Dena'ina lands, but I consider both Alaska and India my homelands. My formal training is in archaeology, anthropology, and art conservation, obtaining degrees from Bryn Mawr College and Winter University of Delaware. I previously operated a private conservation practice working with a variety of museums, culture centers, and Native corporations around the state, and completed internships at the Smithsonian's Museum, Conservation Institute, and the National Museum of the American Indian, as well as UPenn, University of Pennsylvania's Museum, and Vitenskap Museum in Trondheim, Norway. What brought me here today, though, is my love of family, stories, and pride in my culture. I come from a long line of strong women and would not be here if not for the sacrifices of my family, both today and those in the past. These strong ties inform much of my thoughts and ethics around cultural heritage. They're based on seeing colonial approaches in both the US and in India, living between two places, each informing my impressions and thoughts of the other. Much of what drives me today was set in place in those early years of immigration, living between two worlds. I share this history because it has impacted my ideas and views of decolonizing and what that means for collections and access at the Anchorage Museum, which you see here. For many years, there have been calls to museums to change their approaches to preservation, access, and even ownership. Laws such as the Native American Graves Protections and Repatriation Act have forced museums to rethink collecting practices and reassess whether material culture was rightfully separated from Indigenous communities. Since 1990, this law has helped change practices. Indigenous people have seen a national museum open on the mall. Thousands of ancestors have been returned to their homelands. As many others have stated in our field, museums are slow to change, but if museums are to remain relevant, supported, and viable, we must re-examine our practices. The legacy of museums cannot be ignored, whether we have contributed to them or not. We have benefited from these colonial systems. Radical actions are needed to effect change and radical ideas. Museums need to address the spirit of decolonizing, giving away power, and creating nurturing relationships with those BIPOC communities that have been excluded, rethinking concepts of authority and decentering the Eurocentric view. If we as cultural advocates truly support the idea of expanding perspectives and being inclusive of marginalized groups, we must reconsider our best practices. We must rethink why our collections exist. Instead of focusing on objects, we must look at the social relationships the collections engender. You can see some views of a museum here. The collections include about 27,000 artworks and material culture items and almost 800,000 historic and documentary photographs. The museum has an open door research policy and offers traditional access to these collections. The archives and library materials are available during open hours in our resource center seen here, and the material culture and art collections can be visited through appointments. We frequently have artists, researchers, descendants of donors and artists, and even classes in our storage places to study cultural heritage items in depth. We provide access virtually through online platforms and fulfill image requests by students, educators, researchers, and often descendants of those pictured or from the communities themselves. Since 2013, we have been going to the Alaska Federation of Natives Conference, where we bring images from the historic and documentary photograph collection. The convention is one of the largest gatherings in the US of Native people with about 6,000 attendees. There's been a long history of taking images of Alaska Native people as if they themselves are a landscape to document, something to collect. Through this project, we've turned that concept around. Alaska Native people are the authority, providing the context and controlling the information. Delegates at the conference help identify places, people, activities. While they're encouraged to identify any unknown images, the focus is more on the memories and stories as people gather to look at photographs together. The project has now expanded beyond a booth at the annual meeting and into individual villages where physical access to these places still remain an issue. As well as we encourage groups to come into the archives. The Photo ID project sparks memories and germinate exchange through conversations and storytelling. While collecting data about the content of the photograph is important, what is more important is the connection that is established between people. The museum is just a place. Over the past 10 years, leading this department, hearing the stories of descendants and source communities, I was struck by the inequity of holding and charging for use of these images by those who have already been victims of colonial systems. I found this to be one of the most disheartening aspects of caring for cultural heritage collections and working in a museum. This led to conversations with SELENA at CBTC about the future of ownership and control over those items related to Chickaloon. We spoke about the needs and desires of CBTC and what the museum could provide and should provide. The museum is taking the next step in access, relinquishing power and supporting the relationship between the collections and the people who originated them. The hope is to reveal and contest colonial practices, to re-envision culturally biased metadata. We will host, fund, and virtually repatriated associated collections to Chickaloon. And I want to be clear here, when I talk about virtual repatriation, we're talking first about photographs and working towards the physical. Working with elders, we will be, to identify individual items and photographs associated with Chickaloon. The museum will create digital surrogates for CBTC. The approach is collaborative, and in a team, we will work together to identify individual items with the elders and SELENA leading the search. The digital surrogates and metadata will be managed and controlled by the tribe within their database. They'll be able to control what data is shared, even with us, and how that information is used. We will also go to Otna communities to host, we will host gatherings and provide access to those that are not in Anchorage. This is essential as the museum needs to repair the relationships that have been inequitable for hundreds of years. Of course, the future is unknown, but the idea is that this project will lead to revisiting actual ownership and create an equitable situation where the tribe owns their own material culture. And I just wanted to share this slide because this is a pilot project and it's based on some work of another colleague, Melissa Shaganoff, who began this project or this idea with objects and taking them into communities. And so right now we're focusing on photograph collections, though the communities that, or the people, the elders that will be coming on site to the museum will also have access, not just to the photograph collections, but basically all the cultural heritage items that are related to Chickaloon and the Otna people. And I'm going to pass it over to SELENA next to present the tribe's perspective and details about the process.
Monica. Chickaloon Native Village is an Otna Dene federally recognized tribal government located in South Central Alaska. The mission of the tribe is to perpetuate our ancestors' beliefs, customs, traditions, and values, and steward our environment to help our citizens thrive. Dating back to the early 20th century, Chickaloon Native Villages territories were subjected to large-scale resource extraction of gold and coal, and related infrastructure developments of the Alaska Railroad and the Glen Highway that resulted in the introduction of new settlers that brought diseases, boarding schools, and alcoholism that devastated the tribe. For many years, these factors, along with the inability to share their story in their own words, created a generation of tribal citizens, now elders, disconnected from their cultural traditions. For the past 6 years, CBTC has dedicated staff, time, and resources towards developing and growing our cultural resources to support healing and cultural perpetuation. Next slide, please. In order to understand CBTC's intent with this project, I think it's important to address physical versus digital repatriation. Collective memory of colonialism has been perpetuated through the ways in which knowledge about Indigenous people is documented, classified, and represented. For those of us who identify as Indigenous, it still offends the deepest sense of our humanity. It has influenced how Indigenous people are viewed through antiquated assumptions based on brief encounters with only a small group of us. It also attempts to place us within the limits of a one-size-fits-all package that disregards our unique histories, languages, and cultures. Colonization continues to extract and claim ownership of Indigenous ways of knowing, our cultural expressions, and then simultaneously rejects and disregards source communities and denies them further opportunities to be creators of their own nations. Because of this, and I cannot speak for all Indigenous communities, but for many, physical repatriation is always the goal, for it conveys a full understanding and acknowledgement of the role of an institution has played in historical trauma. Physical repatriation is not only about returning material and knowledge, but it is about giving control back to source communities. Since its adoption, the National Graves and Repatriation Act, also known as NAGPRA, has placed a spotlight on past harmful practices within the museum and archival industries and how they have accumulated the materials in their collections. Although NAGPRA has given source communities the authority to enforce the return of their ancestors' remains and cultural heritage expressions, it still has many problematic issues that prevent the full repatriation of all cultural heritage expressions housed outside of source communities. Currently, NAGPRA is not applicable to entities that are not federally funded, nor does it support the repatriation of non-tangible materials found in archives. Because of this, many tribal communities continue to seek alternative approaches towards repatriation. Next slide, please. Museums and archival repositories can be painful sites for Native peoples, as they are intimately tied to the colonization process. Indigenous repositories directly reflect a tribe's self-determination and cultural sovereignty. Because of this, a new framework of collections management must consider Indigenous ways of knowing. For CVTC, this new framework includes digital and visual repatriation. CVTC actively seeks proactive partnerships with repositories who not only acknowledge CVT's connection to cultural materials within their holdings that may not follow under NAGPRA, but understand that by returning these materials to the tribe, they can restore and rejuvenate traditional Ahtna-Dene knowledge and values. True repatriation outside of NAGPRA can only occur if control is relinquished. And although digital surrogates are not meant to replace the physical objects, they do provide an opportunity to return cultural knowledge to Indigenous communities with a greater sense of immediacy than physical repatriation, which can take up to years to negotiate. CVTC recognizes the strength and value of its elders, whose numbers are slowly dwindling due to the passing of time and recent issues regarding the COVID-19 pandemic. Because of this, CVTC is determined that although physical repatriation will always be the goal, digital and visual repatriation allows for the continuity of cultural perpetuation without a disruption and loss of cultural knowledge. Additionally, it allows for the return of cultural knowledge documented in materials that are not applicable under NAGPRA and from institutions that are not mandated to observe NAGPRA law. Next slide, please. Always at the forefront of our digitization projects and guiding us is our digitization purpose statement, which is to inform through curated digitization by unearthing our past and illuminating our present so that we may protect, preserve, and strengthen our future generations. Next slide, please. Currently, we do this work through our online digital database, Naidiniana Waltzitla, also known as Information We Share. Our site is supported through the Mukutu Collections Management software and is used as a means of connecting our tribal citizens with their culture, history, and one another, while illustrating the interconnectedness of the Ahtna-Dene of Alaska. The site is unique in that it allows us to contextualize digital materials, also known as digital heritage items, in a manner that is in accordance with our traditional cultural values and traditions. We accomplish this through using 3 features of the platform. Next slide, please. The first is through communities. Now, although the Mukutu platform can be implemented and designed in many different ways, for the sake of our tribe, we use communities as a means of distinguishing our collaborators and partners. Our focus through the site is through repatriation. So because of this, we use communities to distinguish the owners of the materials in which we are using and representing on our site. Currently, we have 4 collaborators. The first is Naidiniana Kaya, Those are materials from the CVTC collections. Next is the American Philosophical Society, which are digital surrogates of materials from the American Philosophical Society's digital database. The Smithsonian National Archives, which are digital surrogates from the National Anthropological Archival Collections. And then of course, our newest collaborator, the Anchorage Museum, which will be the digital surrogates we acquire through this project. Next slide, please. The second feature that we implement are cultural protocols. We use cultural protocols as community protocols. These determine levels of access. This allows us to be able to curate materials and ensure that sacred materials are kept sacred and within the communities that are only allowed access to them. Currently, we have 3 levels of community protocols. The first is Ketsune, which are public access. So when you visit our site, all users, without having to register, are able to view all items under the Ketsune protocol. The second is Dene peoples. These are individuals who identify as a member of the Atna or Dena'ina Athabascan communities. And then finally, we have Naidiniana Kayak tribal citizens, who are Chickaloon Native Village tribal citizens. In order to be able to access the Dene and Naidiniana Kayak protocols, users must register through our site. We get a notice of an individual who is interested in gaining further access to these 2 protocols, which is then vetted through our cultural committee. And then once it's approved, it gets sent back to the user, and then they are then given access to these additional materials. Next slide, please. The third and final feature that we implement are traditional knowledge labels, also known as TK labels. These identify and clarify community-specific roles and responsibilities regarding access and future use of traditional knowledge. The 3 different types of TK labels that we implement are provenance labels, protocol labels, and permission labels. Each of these really allow us to further contextualize and claim ownership of the materials that are represented throughout our site. To the left, you will see images of different levels of different types of TK labels. To give you an example, in the upper right corner with the little illustration of the trees, that is the TK label for seasonal use. In the Atna community, we have stories and songs that are only spoken and sung during specific times of the year. Because of this, we associate and assign the seasonal TK label with those materials so that our users understand that those different digital assets are only used throughout certain times of the year. So they're not shared when they're not supposed to. Next slide, please. Through this digital repatriation project that we're doing with the Anchorage Museum, we're hoping not only to further contextualize our own materials, but to broaden the understanding of materials that are in association with the Atna Dene of Chickaloon Native Village. It is our hope that this particular project will be the first of many, and that we can continue having productive relationships and partnerships with outside repositories. So not only that we can share our story, but that we could also help other tribal communities improve theirs. Thank you. Nan.
Thank you, Selena. Thank you, David. We'll pass it back to you, and we're really pleased to take questions during the question and answer period.
Thank you. I think maybe I was going to ask you, Monica, as long as we're right here, if you'd like to share the second to the last slide. Selena, I got 3 notes from professionals on the webinar to ask you to describe the other TKs. We did the tree and the shadows with seasonality. And it's
Sure.
contextualized so nicely within a lot of conversations about asset liquidity and asset governance, because a first principle that a lot of us assert is that an asset is not an asset without a rights wrapper and without our understanding of it. So tell us a little bit about the other 3 TKs that are here.
Absolutely. In the upper left-hand corner with the arrows, that is the attribution TK label. Any item that has the attribution TK label is trying to draw attention to the creator or the owner or the repository owning the material. So anytime you see this, a user understands that they should be paying note to that because it's an important aspect of the curation process for that material. In the lower left-hand corner is the cultural sensitive TK label. These are linked to cultural sensitive items. More often than not, these materials will only be accessible through the Dene and Naidiniana Kayak protocols. In the lower right-hand corner is the outreach label, and this is to denote items that are only meant to be used for educational purposes.
Thanks so much. It was really fun to see these and to learn about them as we've been talking. And I knew that there'd be a couple questions that would come in. So terrific to have the chance to have the two of you join us today. And our next presenter is Monica O. Montgomery. And let's see, Marianne, my co-host, do you see Monica? Monica, are you here? She had an unexpected situation come up, and I'm not quite sure if she's been able to join us yet.
I don't see her, no.
Okay. Well, while we're waiting for Monica to join us, let's go ahead and I'll start my video up here. We've had a few hands raised and questions come in, so while we're waiting for Monica O, let's go ahead and see if we have some questions come in. I had one come in. Laura and Monica and Selena, you're welcome to turn your cameras on. So Laura, this was an interesting note that someone sent. What have been a couple of surprises for you along the way since the exhibition has been open?
That's a great question. There's quite a few. Maybe only surprises. No. The ones that come to mind most immediately was in preparation for the exhibition was the how game all of our donors were, because there's of course a sensitivity around that, those who originally donated the works. But everyone that we contacted to speak to about this project was actually very excited and wanted to be involved because they want to ensure that none of the objects that they donated shouldn't be in Western museums. So that was a very heartening experience. I would say the other wonderful surprise has been the student engagement that has arisen through it. So we've been doing a lot of thinking, like these are 11 objects out of 1,800 in our collection, and how do we keep this going after the exhibition closes? And we've had reach out from the University of Michigan law students who want to turn this into an annual project where the law students will collaborate with history of art students and throughout the summer, and we'll tackle particular case studies every summer, hopefully for perpetuity until we make it through the collection. So that has been very fun as well. There's been a lot of great response across the university. Yeah, so those are my sort of two initial thoughts.
Okay, and I think I'll take advantage of the fact that we have Selena and Monica here and ask you the same question. As you have been developing the thesis of what you're working on, it was great to see some of the history and background. What were a couple of surprises for you that were sort of either unexpected side railings or like, oh, okay, we have to have a conversation about that?
Well, it's kind of hard since the project is just starting. So one of the things that I think Laura touched on as well is, funding. And so this was not surprising, is that one of the key elements of this project for the Anchorage Museum was that we don't place an undue burden on the Chickaloon Village Tribal Council. And so the funding needed to be found by the Anchorage Museum. That's not to say that CVTC isn't actually undertaking a huge contribution, because they are. But I think for other institutions who are undertaking this, I think it's important as part of the restitution and reparations that museums bear the burden. And I think NAGPRA kind of addressed this, but I think a lot of museums balked at it. And that really, over the last 30 years, you see the results where tribes are unable to maybe advocate for themselves because of funding differentials. Museums have the ability and the access to donors and things. And so that's one of the things. It wasn't surprising. I guess it was surprising. I was really pleased that the Institute of Museum and Library Services funded our project. I'm really happy that they did. I don't know if in a different time period, whether we would have been successful. We are in a particular time. I can't ignore that because other types of projects that have been similar to this that we have proposed have not been supported by federal organizations. And, you know, sometimes it's that the project isn't maybe what their focus is, but I think it's important to recognize that financially it is the responsibility of museums to take this burden, and I think moving forward, it needs to increase.
Selena, any surprises or unexpected little, when the ting, something popped up and caught you a little bit out of one of the fields that you weren't expecting?
I would have to definitely echo Monica's note about financial contributions and responsibilities. We were actually very pleasantly surprised that the Anchorage Museum has definitely stepped up and assuming not only responsibility, but a general interest in trying to support our work. So one thing that Monica didn't mention as part of that financial undertaking is they're providing stipends to all of our culture bearers and elders who will be on our research team. We have people that are going to be coming from various parts of Alaska to support this project and helping us through the research and identification phase, as well as contributing cultural content to build the metadata for each of those images that we'll be selecting. So I think for us, some of the challenges that we always have is not only selecting the culture bearers and the elders to help in the project, but also making sure, because our history is so interconnected with the other Ahtna and Dena'ina Dene in the region, making sure that we're constantly communicating the work that we're doing so that we're more inclusive and allowing them to participate if they wish in our work. Some of the other things that we've been pleasantly surprised about, as I mentioned earlier in our presentation, we have other communities represented on our site. And so far, all of the repositories we've visited and worked with have been, by having the community feature on our site, what I didn't mention is each community is allowed to have their own steward. So a staff member from the Anchorage Museum or APS or NAA, they could actually steward their materials that are on our site. However, we've been pleasantly surprised that none of them want to do that. They want to relinquish all the full control to us. So currently, all of those communities don't have a steward. They're all from CUTC staff, which has definitely been a very pleasant thing for us to experience because we have the freedom to be able to do what we want. However, I don't know if that'll be the case moving forward with other repositories we work with, but it's definitely something that we've appreciated, that they've acknowledged that relinquishing of ownership in the sense over their digital surrogates that they've given to us. I think also one of the things we would like to see moving forward, as I mentioned earlier with that physical versus digital repatriation, is seeing institutions taking the next step, not only just trying to engage with digital repatriation, but taking the next steps in working with us to maybe go to physical repatriation, which is something that a lot of museums are currently hesitant to do. It's a very contentious subject for a lot of folks, but for me and for I know a lot of my tribal colleagues, that is truly the next more intentional step for institutions to take. Right now, I hate to use the word settling, but that's pretty much what our tribe is doing. We're settling for digital surrogates in the meantime to make sure that we're still doing cultural perpetuation, but please don't misunderstand. Our goal is always going to be physical repatriation and show our other source communities.
One of the things that I've so enjoyed in our conversations amongst the group here as we've been getting ready for today, and Selena, you point this out with acuity and importance, is the role of cross-institutional governance when we're talking about these issues, when we're talking about decolonizing data or about data hoarding that might have occurred, let alone the issues around the physical movement. But I think you've done such a good job, and it's so important for all of us in the session today to be aware that as these tectonic plates are shifting underneath, that the governance sort of up above is important to pay attention to in how collaboration occurs and how we look at strategic alignment that's been internal, in your case, Chickaloon, but also among and between the users of the technology and your kind of fellow travelers, if you were. So it's very interesting to hear you just comment on, well, they have the right to be stewards, but the governance structure is working well for you, because it's so important when there are hierarchical metadata issues. There's who controls the digital definitional issues, as we've talked about on a couple of our prep sessions. So it's been a nice arc of capability that I think you've developed, and important for the community to be aware of, that good practices are being asserted. I also think it's part of the reason why the project got funded personally. So we've had a couple of questions come in, and I'll just read them aloud. It's just, it's easier. So Selena, something that you said regarding digital surrogates implies that they're taking ownership, see if I can get this right, over the material, including metadata. So here's the question. Is that metadata, stories, memories, language, correct spelling, going back to partnership repositories?
Absolutely. We think of this as a collaborative project. However, I should note that some of that cultural knowledge is of a private nature and is only meant for our more restricted protocols. Mm-hmm. So we will be sharing that information with the Anchorage Museum. We feel it's our responsibility to not only make sure that they're being, the materials that the Anchorage Museum owns is being shared in the correct manner, but also that they're educating their audiences in a correct way. However, with that understanding, some of this knowledge may be of a sensitive nature. Right now, in just preliminary conversations with Monica, we don't really foresee that happening, but it is, the Anchorage Museum does understand that any of that type of information will not be disclosed. However, we're very open to the conversations that we're having with the Anchorage Museum. And one thing I also didn't mention is throughout the research process, when we'll be going to the Anchorage Museum, mm-hmm. we're going to be documenting the entire process. We find when we do, when we have our CVTC finds when we have our culture bearers and elders going through the identification process, a lot of conversations arise. And this is what is used to build our cultural narratives on our site. This will also be the information that will be used to create the metadata for the materials that we'll be looking through. So through all of that, we'll be working with the Anchorage Museum to decipher what they're going to keep and what they're not going to have access to. We have a cultural committee comprised mm-hmm. of staff members, council members, as well as elders. And they will help with the vetting process of what information can be public and given back to the Anchorage Museum and what will be retained specifically for our more private protocols.
Great, thank you.
Hope is that we will have, in this process and the workflow that Selena is describing is that the control is always with the tribe. So if they deem certain images that should not be on our online platform because mm-hmm. they have restricted access, we would remove those. Also, if there are image requests from outside parties, those would go through CVTC as well. And then also, as she mentioned, we have no expectation of gaining metadata, actually. Like whatever the tribe wants to share, that's up to them, and it's all in their decision making. We will be happy for any, but we also have no expectation. It's really all about the relationship building and moving towards what Selena said is an equitable situation, which is the physical repatriation, and this is just a step along in the process.
Yeah, I really like it.
Appreciate you saying that, Monica.
Yeah, I'd like a comment that Brad shared with us. Rather than use the term settling for digital assets, maybe use accepting digital assets while waiting. It's kind of a nice turn of a phrase there along this journey. We had another interesting question come in, and let me just read through it. Digital surrogates can mean a lot of different things, from digital photos to high resolution 3D models and 3D printed replicas, shades of what you shared, Laura. When you talk about digital surrogates, are you primarily concerned with photos, or do you also consider more complex surrogates in this process? And Laura, you want to take an answer at that, and then we can pass it around.
Yeah, I would say digital surrogates are definitely more than just photographs, 3D models being one of them. Again, throughout the student engagement with the project, we're working with this extremely interesting student who is interested in creating surrogates that actually do not use environmentally harmful 3D printing materials. If that is the preference of the source community to have a replica retained at UMA, that is to be seen. So it's definitely a broad category. And I think, you know, that in the case of the Nefertiti hack, it was such an interesting and pertinent case study where I feel like the artists really just touched upon so many different issues, including intellectual property rights. Like the Nefertiti bust has been reproduced so often and actually has been a source of revenue for the museum in Berlin in a way that can be, you know, financially shown and tracked. And I also want to say, like, though we also have reproductions of some of the works in our collection, they definitely do not bring the same revenue as the Nefertiti bust. But yeah, by making all of that publicly available, these digital surrogates, they're sort of undermining the exclusivity and the hoarding of this data that museums tend to do.
Let me unpack that one cousin that spun off from that there, and sort of a loose 23 and you statement. You just mentioned reproductions.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if, as part of the investigation that's going on, if that is part of the investigations. You know, museums do derive revenue from the sale of reproductions, and whether it's a postcard or an earring or whatever that might be, a calendar. And I was just wondering if that as an issue complex has come up for you. And then Monica, and I'm going to ask you and Selena that question. So, because the IP is a big deal.
Absolutely.
Everybody
comments
on it, so.
And it has not yet, but yeah, as I mentioned in the talk, there has been a lot of conversation. So let me actually go back for a second to maybe the surprises that have come out of this project too, is there's a more and more, what's the word I'm looking for, realization in the US. And this is based on Teju Cole, who I'm sure many of you know, the author who also writes on photography for the New York Times, but he has been very outspoken about the repatriation towards African nations being extremely tied up with white men's guilt, and that it's a new version of the white savior complex, and is in fact, when restitution is not requested by institutions in Africa, it's this way of washing one's hands of the sordid past and moving on in a way. So that's why I wanted to introduce that last point about how interesting it could be if the institutions on the continent do not want the physical object returned, but if we in fact return the rights and make annual payments, make payments when reproductions are made, it could be a source of income. But then of course that raises all of these questions around value and how would that be determined and who would this revenue go to? So another Pandora's box is opened, but I do think it's an interesting model.
Thank you. And Monica or Selena, do you have a thought about this? And I did appreciate you raising the rights issue at the end. I thought it's an interesting continual thought to have in perspective about it.
Go ahead, Selena. I have actually a tangential thought, so I don't want to.
And let's see. Go ahead, Selena.
I definitely agree with Laura in regards to digital surrogates are more than just photographs. Actually, the digital surrogates we have from APS are audio recordings and the reason why the first institution we ever reached out to do digital repatriation was APS. And that was because APS had audio recordings of an Atna elder from the 1950s, who's no longer with us, but we have him in photographs. So it was a way for us to further contextualize the photographs within our collections, because the recordings were taken by an anthropologist who interviewed him, and it was with learning Atna language. And I could go through a whole entire story about our tribe and language, but the last fluent speaker of Western dialect of Atna Athabaskan is no longer with us. So all of that cultural knowledge of and fluency of the Western dialect, which our tribe speaks, is no longer exists. And Atna is not a written language, not until recently. So because of that, we are basically piecemealing together Western dialects so our tribe can speak their original language. So having the ability to get digital surrogates of audio recordings of Atna language is very important to us. In regards to some of the other stuff that was mentioned, we haven't had too many issues in regards to copies of materials and reselling. Currently, right now, our focus has been oral histories, audio recordings, and images, simply because for us, that is what initiates conversation and retention of memory and stories. I think at some point we may get to that issue, but as of right now, and I know we've discussed it, we don't particularly like or agree with the selling or reproductions of our materials by institutions that are not related to the Atna Dene community. But as I mentioned, we haven't gotten to that step yet, and nor have we noticed that there's an institution that's currently doing that. But that's kind of where we're feeling at right now.
Great, thanks, Selena. Monica, I'm quite curious about an opinion and a tangent.
Yeah, I had kind of two tangents, which might not
Only
be the,
two?
this might not be the forum, but two things. There's been some discussion amongst, I think, Indigenous artists especially, is instead of creating replicas that go back to communities, why aren't the replicas made and retained by the museum and the original go back? I personally think we should hire artists rather than doing a 3D print or a 3D scan. There's a lot of artists out there in these communities who could use those funds, and you would have objects made with similar materials, all these things. And that's just a personal sort of approach. I understand the appeal of the tech and the appeal of the 3D printing and what you can do. But having seen and been involved with 3D scanning and then 3D printing, the amount of labor and time, I think, oh my gosh, all that money that was spent on that could have gone to an artist who's trying to make a living. And so that's a personal thing. And then the other tangent was, I was interested, Laura, what you said about the sort of savior complex and the guilt. And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking one of the shifts that we've been talking about is, instead of telling people what they want, perhaps maybe asking and listening and moving forward that way. And that kind of idea of collaboration and an effect, rather than focusing on the material culture and what it, that's the only thing and it becomes a transaction. Like, focus on the relationship that you're developing with communities. And it may not be an institution that you work with, but it might be a community, and focusing on that relationship and then seeing where it goes. I'm not here to tell Selena what she wants. Selena is there to tell me what she wants and what the tribe wants. And she listens to her cultural committee and her elders. And I think that, that's the sort of approach that I'd like to see more of. And as I work with other communities, not just Chickaloon, that's the thing to keep in my mind, is that I'm not here to have with any answers. I'm really here as a person who can perhaps facilitate and support the work of communities while working towards reparations and equity within our sort of field.
Yeah, exactly. I love what you just said. Like, I love the idea of using artists to replace any objects that would be returned or make new ones, because it would be another source of revenue for them. And I'm so in agreement with that's what you were here really is about, because we've still been struggling and grappling with this question of initiative. Like, should we passively await repatriation claims to come in and then respond? What the positive to that model is, of course, that you then have a clear partner because there's someone asking, and you are not the one deciding who you will ask. And that is where a lot of that's where it gets very complicated. But the negative is, of course, that we're sort of we are absconding ourselves from responsibility by this notion that, oh, our collection is online, so you can go and find it. But it's actually our responsibility to talk to our partners and be like, this is what we have. Is there anything that you feel or you are interested in having the physical object returned? Is there anything in the way that we are talking about or treating these objects that you do not agree with, that you would like to see differently? So that's what the process is. I think I recently had a colleague make this comment, and it's really stuck with me. One of the challenges is how African collections have been formed in the US is it was very much like, we'll collect one object from this culture as representing that entire culture, and one from this one. And so we are dealing with not the whole continent, because there was a lot of collection bias, but there's a lot of communities that we would have to be great partners to. And I'd love to see us work towards a model where maybe particular museums are designated as a sort of a buddy system, where a particular museum is the partner to an institution in Ghana or in Nigeria, and actually both repatriation requests and research requests are funneled through them to make it easier on our partners, and more streamlined process. So that's just another thought to throw out there.
I see that Monica's on the call, but I'd like to just add one final thing before we keep moving forward. Coming from a source community, I really appreciate both the comments that Laura and Monica are making. Coming from a source community, we find it more meaningful when institutions reach out to us, which is one of the reasons why our tribal council was supportive of our project, the Anchorage Museum. They did reach out to us versus us having to reach out to them. It was all because we just randomly had a conversation, and they were the ones that really had this idea, and we just kind of jumped on board with it. But I think anytime a repository reaches out to a source community, it means so much more, because you're taking that first step to acknowledge things that weren't necessarily done well in the past, and you're trying to make a correction, and you're trying to do it in a collaborative and meaningful way. When we have to reach out to you, it is still coming from a very much colonized way of doing things, because you haven't accepted or acknowledged that. So I can always recommend to institutions and repositories, if you really want to do this work, you need to really do this work. And it's about developing a relationship. It's not about just making a phone call and asking for someone to consult. It's really about getting to know our communities and about immersing yourselves and getting to know us. Because for us, yes, this is a partnership with the Anchorage Museum, but we have now established and are building a relationship with them. And we're hoping to continue that relationship with them moving into the future, way past this project.
Well, SELENA, with that context and getting to know you, as I've had the delight in doing these last few weeks, and Monica and Laura, we now have been joined by Monica O. Montgomery, who is one of my fellow neighbors here in the metropolitan Washington area. Monica O. was part of my deep inspiration for wanting to try to find time to talk and converse and contemplate. And Monica, we're so glad that you can join us today, and we're going to give you the chance to share your screen and take the helm, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Can I be heard? Is everything okay with the audio?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you to my fellow co-presenters and panelists. It's a pleasure to greet you all today, and I am going to begin sharing my slides. So I'm glad you heard from the experts first, because I am a theorist and an enthusiast and someone who is looking to create practical strategies for what I'm terming as museum remedy. I am someone who is identifying as a Black American woman who is very interested in both the return and restitution and repatriation of cultural artifacts, sacred remains, etc., to indigenous communities and African communities and communities around the world who have had their items stolen, right, plundered, and illegally removed. And so this is a cause, I guess, that is near and dear to my heart, and I'm on a learning curve around that. And again, I want to just give an extra shout out and signal boost to those who are doing the work, the curators, the collection staff, the indigenous community representatives. I look forward to learning from you and with you. I also want to honor that I am on the native and unceded lands of the Anacostan and Piscataway tribes here in the DC, Maryland area, and honoring all that they do to steward the land, and both the living and the passing that has happened within those communities. So I wanted to say that as well. So I have many hats that I wear. Among them, I am a social justice curator at the Smithsonian Arts and Industries Building, having just finished curating an exhibit about the future called Futures. You all are welcome to see that. It's up until July, right down on the National Mall. But also, as I think about the future and curate about the future, both the art, the history, the science, the speculative technology, I realize that there does need to be a lot of reconciliation for the future. So that's why I've begun to learn more and read and just do a process of self-study about what does it look like to return items and to repair goodwill and try to build and forge relationships with source communities around the world. I'm also a graduate professor teaching classes about museums and social justice and community engagement. And I do a lot of DEAI consulting, and you're welcome to connect on LinkedIn. I hope to find a way to connect with each and every one of you in the coming year and months. So we have to just clear the air, right? After this year / these years of upheaval and shift, our communities are expecting more from us. And when I say us, I mean us as institutional stewards and leaders and museum workers and those who are adjacent to art and culture and heritage, and what happens to the fate of collections, those with questionable provenance and those with clear provenance. There are lots of people coming in our doors looking for care and looking for repair. And wanting more of us as museums and wanting transparency from us. And our sector, right, museums and digital, it demands new standards in museum practice. And that's what I think we're on a learning edge around in this symposium and other ways. So I, in the spirit of just calling a thing, wanted to highlight some of the things that we're up against, that we're fighting against as progressive practitioners in museums and DAM. So we're fighting against systemic racism, cultural insensitivity, implicit bias, and systems of oppression, amongst other things. All of this is the kind of swirling, stewing pot of isms and issues and ways that people of color and indigenous persons and persons who are otherly abled and persons who fall outside of the mainstream dominant culture often get oppressed and othered and erased, right? We're fighting against that, the harm, the offense, the insensitivity, excluding people, actions and beliefs that express bias. Even if we are unaware, we have to be accountable for the impact despite our intent, for all the compounding effects of these things, how they filter into our museums and workspaces and other institutional spaces, for the hidden histories and the histories that dominate and block out the sun of other people's shine, for those who have been advantaged and are privileged, and for those who are disadvantaged, and how to reconcile that. And I found this interesting meme on Twitter talking about what the problem is. So the problem isn't necessarily a person or personal identities, but it is the isms and the issues within that. So this author writes, the problem isn't men, it's patriarchy. The problem isn't white people, it's white supremacy. The problem isn't straight people, it's homophobia. And all of these are interconnected, and more than these are interconnected within systems of oppression. So don't let your individual defensiveness saying, I'm not this, I'm not that, paralyze you from dismantling them. And when we think of systems of oppression, honestly, museums and other cultural institutions have been complicit within those spaces, and they similarly need, I won't say dismantling, but maybe dismantling, but certainly a reset and a refresh so that we can lead in a new and positive and ethical direction. So I'm here to talk about this theory of museum remedy, which I am pulling out of the ether from examples of institutions that I see doing great work and colleagues that I see doing amazing work, as well as theorizing around what does it look like to come into right relationship, right? Acknowledging what's wrong and what's right and how to get it right most of the time, more of the time. So the way that I'm defining museum remedy, especially as it relates to this topic about return and repair and restitution of items that are cultural and sacred from source communities they were taken from, is looking at methods to mend injustices, to repair relationships between museums and their publics with a focus on these three: engagement, inclusion, and broadly repair. What does that look like? Engagement, inclusion, and repair. How can those terms and those ways of working be used to create remedy? And I think that museum remedy is really about this paradigm shift where we embrace our visitors, our communities. That could be neighbors near and far, that could be people throughout various diasporas, but realizing that we have to be urgent about cultural sensitivity and all that that entails. We have to right our wrongs and admit our misdeeds and be on a new path toward reconciliation and restitution and repair. I'm using many terms somewhat interchangeably that may not be technically correct, but I guess the goal is, right? Restitution, repatriation, return. How do we bring items back to where they are from and begin that process of transformative justice, of apology, of righting those wrongs? Forgive me if I am using terms that are a little fuzzy around the edges or that I have not previously defined, but I do encourage you to use the term that is comfortable for you and for the groups and the communities you're working with. But ultimately, the path of remedy is the path that we're on. So looking at, the breakdown of museum remedy, right? What this could be and what it could mean, how we embrace our visitors and our community around that urgent cultural sensitivity and repairing of the relationships between a museum and its publics and the ultimate mending of injustice. It's very high-minded, it's very utopian, but I do feel like it's doable and it can be broken down in many parts and ways. The way that I am defining engagement is ultimately connecting with audiences in ways they can see, feel, learn, and understand. So can it be quantified in a way? And when I do my classes about museums and community engagement, I encourage my students, I'm saying, how are you engaging? What is the engagement touch points? And how can you evaluate that? And we know in our overlapping industries, evaluation is so important. And so can a visitor see or feel or discern when they're being engaged? Is there learning and understanding in that process? And ultimately, the process could involve, right, community problem solving or decision making, but using community input to make better decisions. That's more so the process of gaining feedback from the community when you're engaging them. So how can this be an equitable, practical approach as it relates to return? I think it's important that our institutions are transparent and accountable. So doing the right things and publicly sharing that to all who are interested. I've seen museums recently do accountability reports and/or inviting people to certain town hall sessions to share where they are in certain projects. I love the spirit of that. I love the civics of that. It shouldn't be a clandestine closed door affair. And so that is one way to be engaging or engage members, is having audiences and everyone in the field know what is the provenance of your collection. And if it is in question, how do we make that public? How do you acknowledge as an institution what went wrong and how you're striving to make it right? And how can you host programs and dialogues and other sorts of events that make the transparency through the process manifest, that share out in a regular basis what is happening and what you intend to do about it. Inclusion, defining it simply here as radiating welcome and belonging. You might hear this term welcome and belonging. It's as simple as it sounds. How do we make our visitors, our audiences, anyone who walks through the door feel that they are welcome, not feeling off-put or unsettled or anxious, and not wondering, do I belong here? Can I come here? Oftentimes our audiences, and I cite this and say this often, there's a term called threshold fear. The term was coined by Nina Simon, who is an author of many museums about museum books about practice within museums. And she says that threshold fear looks like an audience member or visitor not being sure if they can or should walk through the door, wondering, do they have accessible accommodations? Is there bilingual, signs? My mother tongue is not English. Can I speak my mother tongue there? Can I afford this place? Is it too expensive and out of my league? Will the security guards and other visitor staff, mean mug me and grill me down and look at me in ways that make me feel uncomfortable? All of that factors into a visitor's mind before they even come to the visit. So we have to be very explicit in digital, in person, and every other way of being welcoming and creating that sense and space of belonging. So back to inclusion, it's the consideration for audiences and making sure we're eliminating any barriers that prevent participation. Everyone and anyone can and should be welcome. In curating the Futures exhibit at the Smithsonian, we made sure we had things for several different heights, for adults, for teens, for young ones, for persons who are using wheelchairs or those who are otherly abled. There's a whole lot of resources about accessibility, and then thinking of accessibility beyond disability or other ability, but just how can people connect in your space? So all of that factors into the realm of inclusion. And I think if we think of an equitable, practical approach, how to make this manifest around return, how do we involve and include everyone in the process? And the proverbial everyone, not literally everyone, but maybe everyone who wants to be involved, or everyone who was curious and wanted to get the transparent update about what's happening. How do we make things more of an open call instead of a closed door tap on the shoulder? How can we get feedback from the folks who are affected and others about the stewardship and the display and the context of showcasing a cultural item or an item in question that needs to be returned? And how can source communities have agency in the process? Ultimately, them being the experts, them being the ones that items are going to be returned to, how do we give them the power and the empowerment to be in concert with the museum guiding a process? And then lastly, repair, right? What does it mean to repair something? To fix what's broken, to mend it. And so if we think about repair, especially through the lens of community, I think this plays out in terms of pathways for truth and reconciliation. You may not hear that term a lot in museums, more so in human rights and other industries, but there is a good case for support of truth and reconciliation within museums and how that can become a part of our practice too. Acknowledgement and the restitution, the compensation towards affected and source communities. How do we make it right? And I think that looks like a lot of things, but among them, public apologies, and including in the interpretation around the plunder, the empire, the capitalism that brought the item in question to that museum that's having it be showcased, as well as bringing recognition to the source and affected communities and elevating the intangible cultural heritage and the ways that they create art and mark time and history and heritage in the world, bring glory and bring honor to those persons after their items have been taken, and in light of their items being taken, and ensuring that their items don't stay taken. So ultimately returning items. So this is a working framework, right? And definitely needs folks like yourself to think about how we can adopt this into our specific situations of the places we work, the places we're on boards, the ways that we advise museums, those of us who are consultants, and the ways that we're ultimately trying to uplift museums as a community of practice. I think there's definitely more to consider, but if we're just thinking engagement and inclusion and repair and how to fix and solve through those lenses, there is a lot that we can do. I've showed this image before. I'm not quite sure of the source, so forgive me. I found it online. That's not good enough. I'm going to do a reverse Google image one day and get the citation for this. But I've seen it and I was inspired by it. And I hope it inspires you to realize that Indigenous cultures writ large, right? There's so much happening, and the context and the complexity of the culture that is often not properly documented or interpreted or just shared with the general public about the culture. So you may go to Encyclopedic Museum and you might see a hall of sculpture or statues or, fiber arts, woven items. You may see something that was quite likely taken and or something that is perhaps been properly donated, but whatever the case of what you're seeing, there's more context to it, right? There's the worldview and the histories and the oral traditions and the family and community networks, the languages, the ecological knowledge. So many affected and source communities are in close connection with nature, right? And items that we're looking at on a pedestal were being used. They were practical and functional. What does that look like and how does that factor in relationships with other nations and government systems? So there's a lot of context that is missing, oftentimes in the presentation of items when they come up in a museum context. And so that's why this diagram has what's above the surface, which is just the material culture, the item, and what's below the surface, which are the components of a culture that's less visible, but that is necessary to contextualize the material culture. And I do believe that there should be a better job of this, certainly when we think about digital asset management and the ways that things are tagged and the ways that things are documented and archived. A lot of this richness is left out. And that is a disservice to the persons and or the people that created these items and to the viewer and the visitor that wants to learn more and authentically understand all that is being presented. And so if we're leaving out half of the story, it's not right. It needs to be remedied. And we have to think critically about how can we put more richness, more context into the digital asset management process and other processes. Just reflecting a little on community engagement, right? And the interactions between groups and audiences and institutions. How can we engage our visitors, right? When these items are in situ in a museum space, right? No matter how it got there, they're being displayed. How do we engage visitors and affected communities and the existing diaspora around these items needing return and being honest and transparent about that? So certainly we want the communities to build goodwill, or I should say we, the museum institution, wants to build goodwill with these communities. We want to gauge receptivity from visitors of what questions do they have? Do they understand these? What do they know? What do they want to know? We want to signal boost the Indigenous communities again and honor who created this or be on a path to figuring that out. As the project that Laura speaks about is kind of help us learn and discover these items, and we're on this public learning journey of figuring out where and who they belong to and how to process that. It's about expanding worldviews of the visitors and soliciting feedback from the visitors and the affected communities and the diaspora, and ultimately fostering meaning making between all parties around these amazing collection items. I think that what I'm just conceiving of, right, of like, how does it look for an item, a artifact, a piece of culture to be taken, right? And what is that process of repair and return? And how do we show concern? I'm calling it a symmetry of concern at every step along the way, right? And so let's say some point back in the days, whatever century you choose, artifacts or cultural items are historically plundered, taken, illegally removed. And that is now realized to be criminal and unethical and barbaric. It wasn't considered such potentially in those days, but now I'm glad that most of us are in alignment that this was not right. And then realizing that those affected communities at the time and still experience the loss and the emotional grief of the theft, whether they are Indigenous, Native American, First Nations, African, Asian, Polynesian, Indian, all of the communities where items have been taken did not like how that felt and are upset about it. And I think we need to realize that there is oftentimes an emotionality that occurs that doesn't get factored into any process or any formal space of the return, but yet that is the thing we're grappling with too. It's not just like, oh, let me give this back to you and your nation, but it's more so like that hurt. And how do we make that right? And how do we come around the emotions and circle arms around those who are feeling them and try to just hold space for that, because it can't be ignored. It is a fact, right? And now people around the world are speaking up. There's a groundswell of folks advocating for the return of items, which is good. And that pressure is increasing, right? And the museums, if they are just now coming to the realization, or maybe they always knew, we have questionable provenance of our items in our collection, or human remains or sacred artifacts, we should do something. And there'll be a lot of that postulating and grandstanding, and we should do something. We are looking at ourselves. We've convened a committee. Stay tuned. Museums take a long time to get to these places where decisions are made, but ultimately it gets there. And then continued intense advocacy from the international community, the Indigenous persons, the governments, the cultural organizations. And that's sometimes where it stays, right? In this the intense advocacy that is happening. Sometimes it gets to this dialogue of apology and responsibility for wrongdoing. Sometimes you actually get to the administration and the negotiation. How do we get this back to you? Who there can hold on to this? Here are ways we preserve it. We'd like to share those with you. What are the rules of engagement of this return? And then I guess the final form would be the ritual of return for those communities, those Native nations, those tribes. How does it look like to receive something back? And what is the commemoration and the ceremonies and the remembrances, the memorialization that has to happen around that? So it's all these different steps of the process, even when we just go beyond, again, the kind of digital asset management element. How does all of this play out? And how can we show a spirit of respect and mindfulness and concern every step along the process? More how can we's. I'm asking questions and not necessarily answering them all, but we're here to figure it out together. How do we simultaneously bring glory to an object and decenter that Eurocentric interpretation or that Western interpretation? How do we uplift the Indigenous origin story and acknowledge that the source community is often in a process of negotiation for the return? What does it look like to redistribute resources and funds and technical assistance? How do we, again, acknowledge where things are from? How can museums make their actions and their misdeeds transparent and interpret a collection with the agency and respect and sensitivity it deserves, while admitting they're complicit with the story of the stealing? How can they be accountable for what is missing and where it went, and realizing the complicated tension is par for the course. That's part of the process, but that also becomes part of the mythology and the story of the object. More questions, but I think it's good for us to wrap our heads and our arms around these things as we do this work together, right? Thinking of repair and return, dialogues of return. How do we prioritize that cultural sensitivity and hold space for those emotions, right? The grieving that happens when people are separated from their sexual items. How do we rebalance the scales of justice? What does the institution owe to the community based on what was taken and how it was, if ever, acknowledged? I do believe that there should be a process for restitution that does include the disbursement and the redistribution of funds. It can't just be, here are your things back, right? Because a lot has happened from then to now. And so how do we make that a process that is understandable, and just embedding the understanding, the mindfulness, the sensitivity around years of advocacy and negotiation and waiting and longing in administrative forms till we get to that moment of ritual of return. A few just things to think about, right? Strategies, more so concepts for processing. I think it's important that we create like a community of practice, like we are here. How can we get together in smaller groups regularly in your region, in your city, within the departments and the folks that work at your museum, within the leadership, right? Within inviting community scholars and those from source communities to all play a part in learning together and doing together. How can we reframe the engagement, right? Usually it's like, hey, we want to give this back, but there can certainly be more within that exchange, and more that is made just remedy, right? How do we really make it right? Like, not just like, again, here's the item, but how do we really make it right? And if there are people in these source communities that are asking for more, how do we give them more? How do we extend the engagement beyond as well? And again, the admitting of wrongdoing and awareness building and the transformative justice and repair of that process. And I think that if you're in charge of a process like this, or you're, adjacent to a process like this, make sure, again, that that cultural sensitivity, the patience, the mindfulness is factored in, that there isn't just a whole bunch of administration and no soul happening in these processes. So I'm going to stop sharing. Again, these are my thoughts and beliefs on ways we can move forward, but I'm happy to cede the floor to the other speakers and take some questions. Thank you.
Great. So Laura and Monica and Selena, Laura, I'd love to have you kind of recontextualize and react to to how lovely it is, Monica, to hear you sort of, it's like having a chance to look at the whole atomic element and all the little things in there that are floating around in listening with you. And Laura, I'd love your thoughts about listening to Monica. And of course, if anybody has questions, we can't see everybody on the screen, but we welcome either things in chat or in the Q&A box for us to pass along. Laura?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Monica. Every time I hear you talk about these issues, I just become more hopeful. I feel more positive about the future. So really, thank you for setting out the questions so clearly, and for raising some case studies. I really like the suggestion that you made about the smaller groups in your vicinity. We're really working hard within the Africanist community to really not try to have all of these individual projects, because there's also, as you said, there's like a lot of museums posturing, and there's a lot of like, we're doing this work really well, but actually what we should be doing is actually talking to each other. Like, what have you learned? How can we make this better? Let's not start from scratch every single time. So I think that's so important. I feel so lucky that I work at a university museum, and that there's also this community with all of the disciplines that have an interest in this, that the students get involved with. And it just makes me feel energized to keep doing this.
Laura, thanks so much. And I think there's a lot of empathic response, that if we could take that pulse among the many professionals who have gathered us, Monica, that would be very much in line with that. Selena.
I'm sorry, what was the question again?
No, just we had a chance to listen to you as a lead practitioner, and one that Monica and I so enjoyed learning about what you and Monica S are doing, and as someone who's very much living the walk of what Monica just outlined, and just your reaction to it and thoughts. Any questions for her?
I don't actually have any questions. I absolutely agree with everything you've said. I definitely think conversations and collaboration are a key part of the remedy process. As I mentioned earlier, I really also believe that having repositories or professionals outreach to source communities is a key first step, versus source communities reaching out themselves. I feel like it shows more of meaningful intent to move forward, and is part of the healing process. I also really appreciate this new view on how museums can move forward in working and truly becoming a community institution.
Great, thanks, Selena. Monica S., I'd like you to just a reaction, a thought, and then I've got a question for you.
I loved your presentation, Monica. Thank you so much. It was really, I echo Laura and Selena, that it was invigorating and thought-provoking, and I really feel joyous in my approach to work. I think that there's one of the words that I've been using and thinking about a lot, just besides being inclusive and reaching out to communities, is the opportunities these new ways of thinking afford us. And I think that these new ways of thinking, they're not new ways of thinking, they're just new to the way we are thinking and museums are thinking, and how we should be thinking more ethically and responsibly, and really the pathways that you sort of identify wonderful sort of verbalizations of things that maybe a lot of people are doing. And Selena and I talked about this, is that sometimes when you've been doing work and you don't realize until you sit back and evaluate that you're actually doing some of this work. I'll just mention that for us at the Anchorage Museum, we've been trying different ways to repair relationships and to nurture relationships. And we have an outreach archivist, a community outreach archivist, and that's her only job. It's a grant-funded position that's transitioning into permanent funding, and she works with communities within our community. It's not just source communities. She's reaching out to, right now, for the last year and a half, it's been the Black community here in Anchorage, as well as Alaska, as well as the Filipino community, the refugee and immigrant community, the LGBTQ+ community. And she's reaching out to them and then having conversations. And I think it's really interesting that fundraising and development people have that mindset of developing those relationships rather than transactional. And I think that we could learn a lot from that in collections specifically, but also in all aspects of museum. Our educators do this as well. It's developing relationships and nurturing those, and then seeing where they lead, and working on repair. I loved that slide you had about the what and the how of engagement, inclusion, and repair. I took a screenshot, Monica, and I will definitely talk to you about that. But I just, I really look forward to deep diving into your slides, because I wanted to listen really carefully. And so I had a hard time reading your slides, but I'll go back during when I look at the recording again. So thank you so much.
Yeah,
You're
that was
welcome.
that was very much Professor Monica. It's so fun to see all of that content and to figure out, how do I absorb this? So, and Monica S., we had a question come in, and you have foreshadowed the answer. How often is there a question about who speaks for the source community? And then, is there an obligation that a museum has to adjudicate disputes when they occur? You've already kind of foreshadowed the answer by talking about the professional who's working full time in this
Yeah.
field. And so, what an interesting, it's part of the answer. So
yeah, so she, it's not the museum's responsibility to educate. I can't say that word quite well. To determine who can speak for a community, I think it's important. We have a little easier time in Alaska with Alaska Native communities, because there are tribal councils and the traditional villages, and we it's government to government. So our director would contact, we might develop relationships on my level as a deputy director or even my staff, but the director speaks to the president of the corporation, or the village council, and that relationship is defined. When you look outside Indigenous communities in Alaska, then you have to start developing relationships more broadly. And we work with multiple organizations within a community. And I think the Black or African American community here in Alaska is a good example, because there is the Alaska Black Caucus, there is the NAACP, there is Association of Black Churches, there's there's sororities and fraternities that are Black sororities and fraternities. There's also leaders in the community, the long-term leaders. There's the official, unofficial community archivist for the Black community. He's an elder in their community who people have given their materials to that we work with. I mean, those relationships are just not with one person or one group. They're really broad, and they have to be, because if you're going to truly be inclusive, you can't exclude a particular group, and you have to be open to bringing people to the table. And so it is difficult, and it takes a long time and a lot of work, and you need to figure out ways of working with disparate groups who may not work together, but you can still work with them and still be supportive of them. It's not just one project, right? There's multiple projects, multiple relationships. And so I think it's the same for the LGBTQ plus community. There's different organizations here in Anchorage that support those communities and different celebrations and different things. And so it's always a constant check-in. Have I excluded somebody? Who have I not talked to? I think that evaluation of one's own work is constant. And so our community outreach archivist, it's related to our archives, but the work she's doing is developing around programs that aren't related to our archives. They're doing a business expo, a Black Business Expo in February. We did a program on being Black and being an archivist in the US. So those archivists were from all over the nation, but then there's also been Black artists here. What does it mean to be a visual artist here in Anchorage? So these are all very different groups, different generations. I think generational difference is also something to think about. So anyway, I'm going on. I'll stop there.
Okay.
Selena.
So Laura, I would be curious, in many ways, Wish You Were Here is all about this question, about these first source communities. I'd love you a framing of your thoughts as that question came in.
Yeah, it's very different than what Monica just described for us, and it relates back to this question that I raised around initiative and this kind of division that has existed around museums, or this passiveness of waiting for requests to come in, and the only, I think, positive in that model is that, as I mentioned, then you have someone to immediately start a conversation with, and in Wish You Were Here, we're definitely trying to be proactive and trying to identify who we should be partnering with and talking to. And that is very difficult because before you know it, you do become the arbiter of deciding who gets to speak for an entire community. So our thinking around this is that, again, this is a very interesting question to raise that is not one that we should be trying to answer, because we are not the deciders here. And by we, I mean UMA. But that it's only through starting conversations, starting relationships with multiple people within one community that you can start getting a sense of, and maybe hearing conflicting opinions and recommendations. We'll see about that too. That's quite possible. And there's some famous case studies of that with the Benin bronzes that we can talk about. But the other thing that sort of came to mind is, I think for a long time, this question of who to return something to has been used, maybe, I mean, not always, I think intentionally, but we have been hiding behind it in the Africanist community. It's like, until we know the perfect way to do this, we can't do anything. And I disagree with that. I think we can try certain routes and then see whether they work. And if they don't, we'll try something else. And that's the whole point of this project, is that I want to do all of that research and experimentation in public and out loud. And it's a very vulnerable place to be in, because it might not work. It might go very badly, but at least we'll have tried.
Well, and I think from all of you, it will go badly with heart.
Yes.
I have no doubt about that. So Monica O, in the work that you did with the Futures exhibit with your co-curators in this wonderful exhibit that's here at the Smithsonian for only a few months, everyone come. you had the question posed, you posed the question in the exhibition of what did people say when they talked about the future in 1876, in 1926, and in 1970, so on and so forth. And now we're asking it 175 years into the Smithsonian. Well, we asked this question back then. What if we ask it today? So I wondered if you could do, as we wind up here, and as the hands of the clock come together to say two, if you could share a little, make a little bridge between that very deep thinking that's gone on to futures and how much you've connected that thinking to how you set the stage for us here today.
All right, you always give me the best intellectual prompts. So I feel like, you know, in looking at the exhibit in the 175 years of the Smithsonian's always been this engine of the future, even though it's often seen as a reliquary of the past. It has been and continues to be cutting edge for its time and day. And just thinking of humanity and all of us, that's the one subject that everyone's obsessed with. Whether you admit it or not, we're always wondering what is going to happen in the future. What will become of me? What will become of this? Where's my community? Where's my neighborhood? Is my future bright or grim? We at the Smithsonian Futures exhibit are taking a decidedly hopeful note. We are forcing optimism in a great way, where we're saying, let's not obsess about the future that we fear. Let's think about the future that we want. And so with that, and looking at times where inventors and authors and makers and activists and those at the margins were trying to envision that future that they wanted and literally manifest it through the sheer will and through the tools and the ways that they molded things together. I think that we can do that same thing in this space with all of these digital asset management and museum practitioners. We can envision this bright future, and then we can work towards it. We know the grim future because we may be living it now, or we may be a party to it. We see how things have gone wrong and how that has affected us, but we're really starting to get on one accord about ways to make it right. And even if you don't know the way, we can conceive together about many ways. We know that the future is not a fact, it's a set of decisions that we all make every day. And so we are making the decision in this moment to share space, to learn, to grow, and to keep coming together to make it right.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And to SELENA and Monica and Laura, and to you, Monica O. We have come together over these last few weeks to frame some issues. We do have the opportunity, as I said earlier, to flip the Kuhnian paradigm. We are at a crossroads where we have the chance, as we unbind content and we regather thoughts about the physical and digital and the co-currency between them, to aspirationally look ahead and to continue to redefine, hopefully on the optimistic note, as we solve these problems and gather together to do this. It's been such a delight for me to learn so much from all of you these last few weeks and today. I thank everyone for joining us. And on that note, with the wish for good holidays and good health to all, this concludes our webinar today.
Thank you.
Good day, everybody. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.